Hello.
Hi,
How are you?
fine, great.
Good. Yeah, I enjoyed your paper yesterday that you had.
Oh, great. Actually, I
All right.
could not get time to read that much, the whole paper. Yeah. I just went through the abstract and some of the overview of what it's trying to do, like the Philal hurdle, the adult stage.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Yeah. Well, we should follow up on it. I don't know. Well, I'll look it over and see what they're doing. And yeah.
Actually, this week and the last week I was busy, so I could not focus on this much. Yeah, but yeah, I think till next week I would try to focus on it and I mean get something and somewhere.
All right. That sounds good. So we had 40 meetings this week. For did we have four or three? I guess we had four or three. Okay, so we had three meetings this week. The first one was on Monday. That was DevoWorm. And this is our group here. And we started in. Barshan gave a little bit of an update on what he was doing. He issued some pull requests this week for his work. So he was doing what he called a smoke test, which is something you do in software development life cycle to test to see if something like a model will run if you when you scale it up. And he was doing some of that and pushing things associated with that. So he talked a little bit about that. Then I presented a paper here on this was on community detection in C. elegans connectomes, and so this was talking about using this method called community detection, which is a method where you look at a network and you try to find its communities. And communities in a network are parts of the network that are densely connected, but sparsely connected with every other part of the network. And so that might seem like it's kind of an easy task, but it's actually not, because you have to search every set of connections to see what the strength of that connection is, and then say what group is sort of self-contained in that sense. And so this paper talks about this in C. elegans connectome for the larval worm. So the larval worm, of course, is after the embryo hatches, and you have this juvenile that goes through four different stages, L1 through L4. And when it's in those stages, the connectome is actually quite plastic. So it's changing its synaptic connectivity quite a bit. So we looked through this paper, and they kind of talk about how community detection works and how they used it in this case. So they were using it to actually manipulate different circuits. So they wanted to see what happens if you drop out certain connections from circuits, what they'll do. And so the reason they did that is because they looked across different larval stages and found that there were different circuit configurations for different stages of development. So for the adult, we know what the circuit should look like. We know what the community should look like. We go back into the larval data, and we see that there are changes in that connectivity that are very interesting. So they use this method called Big Clam, which is a community detection algorithm tailored for weighted and directed networks that explicitly capture overlapping modules. So they're looking at circuits like the movement circuit or something like that. So it's a series of neurons that are connected, but they're also overlapping with other modules. And so when there are changes in one module, there are going to be maybe corresponding changes in another module. So this is the paper presented on this. And they talk about their data set that they use. They talk about how weak ties theory is important here because you have usually, when you have a network that's sort of new, you have a network that's connected sort of randomly. Maybe it has some sort of scale-free connectedness. And then you start to get these weak ties. And the weak ties are important because they tie together two or more groups or modules. And so this is sort of the origin of communities and networks, is you look for these weak ties and you look for the strong ties and you see where the weak ties are joining together groups of strong ties, and you denote that as your network boundary. Weak ties goes back into social network theory. So Granovetter in 1973 developed this term to describe social networks in which you have people who are kind of connectors between two groups. So if you have like one, you might be involved in this group and you might be involved in another group outside of this lab, and you are the weak connector there because you're connecting people from both groups. So that's, and then this holds true for the connectome as well. And so there are some graphs in here where they show neural circuits in terms of how you have these modules, and they're basically connectivity matrices, and you have overlapping connectivity matrices which represent these weak ties, and they can be of different constitutions in terms of connectivity, different regimes of connectivity. And then they get down to these circuits. So these are the circuits where, I can't remember what circuit this is. This is the circuit for it's pharyngeo regulation. So this is they have this thing called the pharynx that pumps, and it regulates the intake of food. And so the pharyngeo regulation is controlled by these neurons, and the take-home message here is that they change their connectivity over larval development. So you start with all of your neurons sort of labeled here, but not all of them are directly connected to this network at first, or the subnetwork. And so the connectivity sort of increases and changes across larval development, culminating in an adult community, which is here. And you have stronger connections and weaker connections, but they're all connected by the time they become adults. And they made a point in the paper that there are different types of neurons that get connected first and then later. So in the pharyngeo pumping community, you have sensory neurons and motor neurons connected. And then by L1, you start to get interneurons connected into this, which then contributes to different behaviors that we see in larval development, but also goes back to that synaptic data set from Whitfleet that we've been working on in this group, where basically there's a lot of different types of synaptic plasticity in larval development. So going from transient plasticity to sort of pattern plasticity, and what roles those might play in behavior. And they give a number of different circuits. So this one is oxygen-related egg laying, and you see very different patterns here. So it's very interesting to see some of these networks and how they kind of get played out in larval development. It's a very nice paper. It's actually something I wish we have written, but we didn't. But we did have another paper that came out this week, and I talked about it in the open source meeting, and I'll get to that in a minute. So this is a paper on mapping morphogenesis and mechanics in embryo models. So this is sort of an overview paper of looking at morphogenesis and mechanics and some of the methods they use to look at that in embryos and embryo models. And so they're talking about embryos, but they're also talking about organoids here too. So they were kind of going in between and talking about some of the mechanisms that sort of contribute to pattern formation in these different types of systems. So they talk about gastroloids, and they talk about 2D gastroloids and 3D gastroloids. And they're talking about relating flow and forces during embryogenesis, like things like tissue flow. So tissues oftentimes migrate, or they always migrate in a structure like this, and they conform to these flows. And you can measure them using particle image velocimetry or optical flow. So you can use different methods to look at these migratory events, and you can characterize them. They also point out that tissues that form in these structures are like an active viscoelastic material, which means that they have both fluid and solid-like properties. And so you can characterize them with parameters such as viscosity and elasticity. So this is kind of, they're using tissue mechanics to model these systems. And then they talk about coarse-grained approaches. So their modeling here involves coarse graining and fine graining, and picking the appropriate type of modeling for the appropriate problem. So looking at larger structures is going to require a coarser description, and looking at smaller structures requires a more fine-grained approach. And then, of course, they're talking about some of these different types of embryoids and other types of organoid structures that you find in different developmental systems and how to characterize those. Okay, so then Susan, of course, is interested in the physics and mechanics of embryos, and she had some things to say about that. Yeah, we go back to the paper for a minute. Then we finally talked about this paper. This is a paper, Could Living Cells Use Phase Transitions to Process Information? And this is a paper that talks about these kinds of, we've talked about this in the group before, biomolecular condensates, which a condensate is a structure in a cell in the cytoplasm that's like kind of an aggregation of different biomolecules. They could be proteins, they could be peptides, it could be RNA structures. And so, but these condensates seem to play a role in different things, and it's a hot field because people see them and they don't exactly know what they do. But the hypothesis raised in this paper is that they're used to mediate phase transitions and to do information processing. And so this is kind of, it's kind of speculative, I guess, but it's also, pretty good in terms of what they're, So this whole idea of cellular information processing is that cellular phase transitions solve a range of problems. So you need a phase transition in the cell, a change in state, to process information. And they talk about information processing in the cell as a matter of expressivity. So if you have that mechanism of the phase transition, what range of things can it solve? And what kinds of things can it learn or adapt to or solve? And so this is kind of an interesting way of approaching this. It's a very interdisciplinary approach involving molecular biophysics, soft matter, and embodied computation. And it's the embodied computation part we're going to come back to next week, because it's, this is something that is very different from the kinds of embodied cognition problems we've been talking about in this group. Okay, so yeah, we're going to come back to this next week. And we finished the meeting with some commentary. On Wednesday, we had our Cognition Futures meeting, and that's, I'll let Jesse talk a little bit about that later. It was interesting. We covered a paper from that special issue that we published in from Royal Society A, and we'll, again, that's something we can follow up on here as well. In this meeting, this was the open source meeting on Friday, we had some interesting conversations about open source and about, we've been on this topic of generative AI and open source, which we follow up in this meeting. Barshan, again, giving an update on his work. I showed his pull request by Friday. He was able to make a pull request. And it just involves some different files that were created and, modified. He did the smoke testing and all of that. Then I actually showed off this paper. So Jayadratha Gayan, who was a GSOC student in 2024 or 2025, I can't remember. Oh, I think it was last year. He did his project on something called temporal graphs. And so his project was called DevoTG, Developmental Temporal Graph Networks. And so this is his part of the DevoGraph repository where he hosted his project. And so he was working on a paper. I try to encourage people to put out a paper on their projects. And he was able to finish up that paper recently and get it posted on the arXiv. So this is the link to the paper here. And I'll show the paper in a minute. This is the paper from the arXiv, DevoTG, Temporal Graph Neural Networks for Modeling C. elegans, Developmental Connectomics. So this is the paper where, he was using that Whitfleet data set that the last paper used. And he did it instead of looking at certain neural circuits, he was just simply interested in changes in the network over time. So looking at how the network topology changes and doing some other testing using area under the curve and some other things. So he's looking at cell division events from cell lineage data and plugging them into these discrete time dynamic graphs and then looking at changes in the connectome. So that's this is what this paper was about. He also did some analyses which were interesting involving rich club neurons, which are these highly connected neurons in the C. elegans connectome, and looking at their network properties. So congratulations to Jayadratha on that. Okay, and then this topic that we talked about. So this is from the Sustainable Software Foundation or something. This is from the SFC. This is a organization, the Software Freedom Conservancy. And so they're interested in advocating for FOSS software, or free and open source software. And I wanted to go through this arc of sort of thinking about the role of generative AI in open source, and especially in open source contributions, because it's an open question, and they actually have dealt with this. They've grappled with this, and they've come up with some recommendations. So I wanted to go over that, sort of how they came to that sort of decision to do that. So back in 2022, this article was published on their organization's blog. If software is my co-pilot, who programmed my software? And this is about how Microsoft bought GitHub, and then once they bought GitHub, they injected Copilot into GitHub. And not only have they sort of encouraged people to use Copilot to build things, which includes open source projects, but they've also used a lot of stuff from GitHub as training data. And this just struggles with sort of the implications of this. For one thing, you have a training set that may include copyright code. And in open source, our goal is to always strive for copyleft code. So copyleft is where intellectual property is protected, but the person who adopts the license gets to choose how restrictive or how unrestrictive that license is. Whereas copyright tends to just restrict everything by default. And copyleft is important for open source because copyleft sort of controls and mediates this idea of remixing or recombination. That is, when you have something that you, say, fork, and you modify it, you're remixing that thing. Or when you have some some media that you take and you remix it, you take out clips of it and you use it for your own purposes, that's remixing. And so copyleft is an important concept there because it allows you to sort of control that remixing process and not always say it's just not allowed, but to use it in a productive way. So this just goes through sort of how open source projects have to grapple with this, not only in terms of intellectual property, but then of course in terms of pull requests and the level of volume of pull requests, the level of quality in those pull requests, and all of that. So this is an issue for maintainers, but ultimately it's an issue for the quality of the projects. So and in 2022 they need to get their arms around all of this. So this just speculates on what might happen and what might happen if we fail to sort of live up to the standards of free and open source software, which of course is freedom to have access to software, access to code, being able to build things in a way that's, enabling instead of sort of proprietary. And we talked about that in the meeting. And so this is just kind of going through some of their philosophy and things like that. Then there's this other post that was published later. I think it was like last year or the year before. And these are recommendations that they had come to. So back in 2022, they had this sort of post about thinking about this problem very broadly. But now they're at this point they're ready to make some recommendations. So the recommendations are here. There are 14 of them ranked in order of importance. And it's really just talking about what the FOSS community and what FOSS organizations should expect and what their mores should be about this. So they should both welcome people using generative AI and be very mindful of, what the contribution is. So this just kind of tries to strike this balance. And it's really guidance for organizations. So if you have a contributor who comes to you and wants to contribute, and they contribute something that was obviously generated using generative AI, if it's of quality, of course, it's welcome. But if it's not of quality, then what do you do? And of course, even if it is of quality and it gets accepted, where does that code originate? And, there are a lot of things that we have to think about there. And it actually goes back to, sort of having quality control in open source projects. But, it also addresses some things that people really haven't thought out very well. That is, what is the procedure for assessing quality of a contribution? I mean, we've had a lot of cases where people have contributed things to open source projects that were malicious. And, unless you have a good quality control methodology, you miss those things. You might accept a pull request that looks of quality on the surface, but then is actually malicious. And so these are things that we haven't really worked out, but, they're thinking about this in the context of Gen AI, but there are other places where it applies. And so they go through all these different things that you can do as an organization. They talk about how generative AI can often be a copyright washing machine that ultimately ruins copyleft. And this is a legal issue more than an open source issue, but it does affect open source organizations. And, also just about, how does it how does it affect downstream licensing? So they advocate for a copyleft everything or a copyleft maximal approach, meaning no matter what, you always want to keep your organization in this copyleft regime. You always want to have an open source license. You don't want to have to be forced to make things proprietary. And of course, then this all relates to the acceleration or the maintenance of an acceleration of innovation under something like FOSS as opposed to something like a proprietary model. Okay, so that's just kind of some of the points there. So we had a discussion about this. Jesse had a lot of things to say because it fits a lot into his interests in the society, ethics, and tech group and all of that. Okay, so I think that was it for that meeting. Well, Kavya had one thing to add, which was the stuff that he's doing on developmental AI, which we talked about before I started recapping the meetings. And so he actually did bring up a paper. Was this paper here? A Mara-inspired framework for raising good robots. And this is Sarah Hamburg et al. And she does a lot of stuff with active inference and development. And so this is just kind of walking through Mara's framework of the implementation level, algorithmic level, and computation level in the context of this problem. And so this is an interesting paper. We'll have to revisit this paper later, as I said. So that was that meeting. Okay, so that was what we had from this past week. I'm not going to recap the Cognition Futures meeting we had on Wednesday because I'll let Jesse do that. So, any questions about that? I did want to point out, I think Morgan sent me this link on LinkedIn. Oh, Kavya. Does the dower stage affect the graph part you showed? It can. I mean, they didn't look at that. They didn't look at dower worms, but that would give you differences in connectivity. Remember, they're looking at synaptic connectivity, so they basically count the number of synapses for a given connection, and when they weight the connection based on those number of synapses that they find. And so in dower worms, you get a lot of changes in synaptic connectivity. So yeah, it would change those a bit. But, this is kind of like they're observing worms and they're saying this is how they vary in connectivity across these different stages of development. So it's, it may be different if you look at different worms, especially dower worms, but even just if you have like defined mutants, say, where you have a certain mutation that's persistent in the lineage of that worm, then you'll have maybe differences in connectivity there too. So there's a lot of variation to explore there. Okay, so yeah, like I said, Morgan posted this on LinkedIn, or a link to this, and it's this book called Embodied Intelligence, Multidisciplinary Perspective on Natural, Artificial, and Hybrid Systems. This was something that was talked about at the Embodied Intelligence conference this year. We had, we have our authors here who are regular contributors to that workshop, and so they were working on this book, and they had a whole session on kind of going through this chapter by chapter. So I'm glad to see that it's out and it's available. This is available open access, I believe. Yeah, and so this is from MIT Press. And it's a book on different types of embodied intelligence and different types of systems. So, they're very interested in robotic embodied cognition at this workshop. They're also interested in human embodied intelligence and everything in between. So there are a lot of non-human animal models that you can use to look at embodiment. And so, you can look at embodiment in virtual reality. And, there's a lot of ways in which you can study this topic. So this is an exploration of embodied intelligence that moves beyond the traditional focus of brains and code to the role of embodiment across various disciplines. So it's not just focused studies. It's really kind of thinking about how embodiment persists across different areas of study. So they have this introduction towards embodied intelligence. They have the opening. They have this chapter 1, convergences of human and artificial embodied perspectives. So sort of how we study it in humans versus how we study it in robots. We have this article, artificial selves, robotiment, which is robot embodiment, and narrative identity in robots. This third chapter, the 30 Years War on Representations in the Active Inference Westphalia. This is by Axel Constant, Andy Clark, and Carl Friston. It's a very Andy Clark type of title, where it's kind of thinking about active inference and its role in representations or neural representations. So there's been this whole, and this came up in Wednesday's Cognition Futures meeting. There's been this whole debate about representations in the brain. So when we learn things, we have maybe a representation of those things. And if we learn things in neural networks, we also have a representation of things there. The question is, what does that representation look like? Is it pervasive, or is it minimal, or does it even exist? And a lot of the people in, say, like the radical embodied cognition camp would argue that representations don't really exist in the brain. They're a product of the environment. And there's this whole debate about representations and whether they exist or not. Sometimes people take the view that, well, yeah, they exist, but in a limited fashion, and all of this. And their point here is that there's been this debate, but then active inference is sort of the Westphalia, or like this is the event that sort of settled the 30 Years' War, ended it. So active inference sort of settles this debate. It's an interesting article, but it's definitely something that probably won't end the debate. This number 4 is predictive processing from sensory motor skills to higher cognition, and again, we have active inference people involved here: Giovanni Pizzullo, Thomas Parr, and Carl Friston. So that's nice that there's this active inference thrust. Then there's this part 2, embodied artificial intelligence. There's this article from Connor Hines and Mahalta Al-Barasin and Alex Kiefer, and these are active inference people as well. They're associated with the Active Inference Institute. This is advantages of ecological AI. That's interesting. Then there's chapter 6, grounded, embodied, and situated intelligence in humans and artificial agents. Then there's chapter 7, embodied cognition and strong AI. Then there's chapter 8, embodied AI and machine learning. Is it really embodied? Chapter 9, the embodied future of robotics. And then that's part 2. Then part 3 is adaptation, morphology, and emergence. So chapter 10 is morphological pre-training. That's from Josh Bongard, adaptation from the inside out. That looks interesting. We've talked about some of this in the context of filtering or embodied filtering. And, this is obviously from a very Josh Bongard point of view. Chapter 11, exploring cognition through a morphological information computational framework. So this is like morphological computation, this area of the book. Chapter 12, this involves Dober, Nuri Dotov, and Tom Froese, and that's embodied AI based on dynamic human-computer interaction. So that's part 3, and then part 4 is emotion learning and embodied interaction. Chapter 13, emotion modeling and its embodiment and transition. Chapter 14, embodying emotions in autonomous and social robots. Homeostasis, hormones, and interaction and embodied AI. That looks interesting. Chapter 15, AI Designer, Know Thyself, what we learn about human intelligence through building artificial intelligence. And that's chapter part 4. And then part 5 is Embodied Intelligence, Unifying Principles. So this is where we're bringing everything together. So 16 is Embodied Intelligence, Enabling the Next Intelligence Revolution. And these are people from the Embodied Intelligence Workshop, kind of considering how this all fits together. Mike 11 has a chapter 17, Diverse Intelligences, the Space of Possible Minds. Then chapter 18 is the conclusion, and that's the book. And so this is, let's see if I can get a link to the book here. All right, there we are. There's the cover. It's a nice cover. They have, so it's 459 pages. So if you're interested in this book, it's available open access through MIT Press. Looks like Vidhi's here. Hello, Vidhi.
Hi, how have you been?
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, just asking how's everything. I couldn't join in last week either. So yeah.
Yeah, we've been doing pretty well. How about yourself? Are you busy this summer?
Yeah, I am. I'm actually working somewhere else and then I'm just busy with their project. So I go to office and that. And then my summer internship is just till 20th July. So I'm just in the phase of wrapping up right now. Then I'll have my final presentation over there. So it's just busy in that. So now it's still a bit lighter, but like before that, like till now, I've just been busy with the project that they're doing, and since a company is just not one project, right? So like if they need any other small help or anything, then I help over there like that.
Yeah, that sounds good. So yeah, glad to
Yeah,
hear that everything's going well.
yeah, everything's fine, going good.
Good. Yeah, great. Actually this was something that I had actually heard from Ankit Grover in the Slack, and he had run across that DevoTG paper, and he was saying that he was pretty impressed by it. He's interested in learning more about it. Then he mentioned some tools we might use to follow up on it, so that's good. Yeah, so thank you, Ankit, for that vote of confidence on that paper. Okay, I'm going to talk about a paper. This is game theoretical interactions of moving agents. This is Wenjian Yu and Dirk Helbing. Dirk Helbing is a complexity person. He runs complexity, like a website where he does a lot of demos of complexity concepts. So I think it's complexity explainables or complexity something like that. And so he's got some interesting, usually he's engaged in some interesting work. He's at ETH Zurich, so that's where the authors are located here. This is from the arXiv, and it talks about game theory and some of the things about agentive systems or multi-agent systems. So I thought it would be kind of interesting for just thinking of what they're doing here. So the abstract reads, game theory has been one of the most successful quantitative concepts to describe social interactions, their strategic aspects, and outcomes. Among the payoff matrix quantifying the results of social interaction, the interaction conditions have been varied, such as the number of repeated interactions, the number of interaction partners, the possibility to punish defective behavior, etc. While an extension to spatial interactions has been considered early on, such as in the game of life, recent studies have focused on effects of the structure of social interaction networks. However, the possibility of individuals to move and thereby evade areas with a high level of defection and to seek areas with a high level of cooperation has not been fully explored so far. So what they're referring to here is they're referring to things like the prisoner's dilemma, where in the prisoner's dilemma, you have maybe like a group of people, could be 2 or 3 people, who are engaged in some sort of activity, maybe a conspiratorial activity. The idea is maybe they've committed a crime together. And then when the police interview them, they interview them both, one at a time. And they want to know what they each know. And they also want to see if any one person will defect and flip and tell the police about the activities of the other people. So they want to see if they can get some sort of defection from the group, which exists in conflict with cooperation within the group. So the group can stick together and no one individual can talk to the police and give them any information. Or one person can defect, and usually, they get their sentence commuted or something, so they get a benefit for themselves, but then the group suffers because the other 2 people get outed or thrown under the bus, as they say. So that's kind of where they're going with this. They're kind of using the prisoner's example, or the prisoner's dilemma example, without actually mentioning it by name. So the idea here is that they're extending this to individuals moving around a spatial array. And so you have different regions of the spatial array where there's a high level of defection, and you can move to places where there's a high level of cooperation. And when you move to places with a high level of cooperation, it selects for, or it encourages group cohesion. Because obviously, if you don't have cooperation, if everyone's in it for themselves, that's not good for collective behavior. And so this is where you have a bunch of agents on a grid or on some sort of spatial surface, and they're moving around, and they're trying to find places that are sort of key for cooperation, and they're trying to evade areas that are centers of defection. That's basically the idea. And so this contribution presents a model combining game theoretical interactions with success-driven motion in space, and studies the consequences that this may have for the degree of cooperation and the spatiotemporal dynamics in the population. So again, this is a multi-agent simulation where there's this imperative, and you can look at the strategies employed by any one agent. And you can look across agents and see that they tend towards the strategy of encouraging cooperation and minimizing defection. But they all do this independently, so they all make independent judgments about this. And it's reflected in the movement patterns of the agents. So they're moving to places where these things are sort of highly rewarded. So there might be one region of the space where cooperation is rewarded. There might be other regions of the space where defection is rewarded. So whatever the payoffs are for those different strategies in different regions of the space determine how these agents move. It is demonstrated that the combination of game theoretic interactions with motion gives rise to many self-organized behavioral patterns on an aggregate level, which can explain a variety of empirically observed social behaviors. So, we're looking at how these behavioral patterns emerge in space. So as the agents move, they move to these areas and they, form groups, they form collectives. And then we want to be able to analyze that at the end of our simulation and see what the outcome is. So getting into the paper, macroscopic outcomes in a social system resulting from interactions between individuals can be quite different from anyone's intent. For instance, empirical investigations suggest that people prefer different types of neighborhoods based on their self-identity. So one could think that integrated neighborhoods should be widely observed, but empirically this is not true. One rather finds segregated neighborhoods, such as separate urban quarters, which also applies to people with different social and economic backgrounds. This is actually building off of showing segregation simulations that he ran in the 60s. And so this is an old problem in urban sociology, looking at different people belonging to different social groups and whether they move into the same neighborhoods or they move into neighborhoods with people of different backgrounds. There's this urban ecological social distance tradition in sociology, and the individual preference tradition in economics. So basically, you're looking at this difference between the sociological lens and the economics lens. The main idea of social distance theory is that differences in culture and interests between social groups are reflected by a separation of the residential areas. This is yet the role of social distance and individual preferences is questioned by the studies of the American urban housing market, which suggests that racial discrimination and prejudices are the primary factor of residential segregation and concentration of poverty. There are 3 stages in the housing market transaction, which is where they kind of go through the information about available housing units, terms and conditions of sales and financing assistance, and then access to units other than the advertised unit. In each stage, the housing agent may behave in a discriminatory way, withhold information from customers, and discourage them. Therefore, the access of minority customers to housing is severely constrained, while the theory of preference-based dynamics assumes that people can relocate freely according to their own preferences, which fails to reflect the real relocation dynamics. And so this just kind of goes through the relevance of this kind of study that they're going to do. So then we can look at this in game theoretic terms. We can look at migration, game theory, and cooperation. So in game theoretic terms, this movement to a more favorable neighborhood could be reflected by a higher payoff to persons who moved, called migrants, in the following way. Migratory behavior aimed at higher payoffs is called success-driven motion. So this is where you're moving to get a higher payoff. And this is what they call success-driven motion, and there's some citations to back this up. As we will show in later sections, success-driven motion can reproduce residential segregation and some other observed phenomena of population dynamics as well, like population succession, which is an example of which is cycles of changing habitation. You see this in ecology with different species in ecosystems. We will also study how a change of the spatial population structure can affect the level and evolution of cooperation in a population. It could be thought that natural selection, implying competition between individuals, would result in selfish rather than cooperative behavior. Nevertheless, cooperation is widely observed also in competitive settings, from bacteria and in animals as well. Game theory has been regarded as a powerful framework to investigate this problem, as it can be used to quantify the interactions between individuals. And so there's a mathematical formalization to this. So the mathematical description of selfish behavior tendencies is often based on the prisoner's dilemma game, in which the reward R represents the payoff for mutual cooperation, while the payoff for defection or cheating on both sides is reflected by the punishment P. So this is where, the idea that if you have 2 prisoners who collaborate on a crime and they get interviewed individually by the police and they have to, tell the police what they know and they get a reduced sentence, but that involves, identifying the other person and betraying the other person's trust and all of that. So the punishment is where the individual flips and gives the police that information. Now the idea is that it's punishment because both prisoners would do this, whereas the reward is when both prisoners keep their mouths shut and the police get no information. So that's the way that's structured in the prisoner's dilemma. So you have reward, you have punishment, and you have maybe some state where one prisoner flips and the other prisoner doesn't. So this is actually the another optimal state where one prisoner gets sort of the reward and then the other prisoner gets the punishment. It's optimal for the one prisoner, but it doesn't encourage social behavior, or pro-social behavior. Unilateral cooperation will occur in the so-called suckers payoff S, where the defector gains T, the temptation. This is what I was describing before. Given that inequalities T is greater than R is greater than P is greater than S, so temptation is greater than reward, is greater than punishment, is greater than the sucker's payoff, and 2R is greater than T plus S. Defection is tempting and cooperation is risky. So you're tempted to defect, and it's risky to cooperate because you don't know if the other person is also cooperating or if they're defecting. So that defection is expected to be dominating, although mutual cooperation improves the average payoff. So the payoff is better when you cooperate, but there's no way to know that other people are cooperating. So you typically will defect, and there's a limited reward there, but at least you know you'll get that reward. That's basically the way that the prisoner's dilemma is structured. So that's what they're using as a way to model the spatial segregation problem. In a well-mixed population where an individual interacts with all the others, a defector's payoff is always higher than the average payoff, which leads to a prosperity of defectors. So defection, of course, pays off higher than the average. And so that actually discourages cooperation. But sometimes you can have, and a well-mixed population is just basically where everyone's interacting with each other. So it's, there's no like preferential individuals interacting with one another. Maybe they have a very varying amounts of trust in each other. So it's not, that's all controlled for. This is, of course, not a spatial game. It's just kind of in a regular setting where you have these interactions going on amongst agents. So when we add the spatial dimension, we should expect that maybe the dynamics will look different. In an evolutionary setting, as it is described by the replicator dynamics, and that's where we have replication of agents and their states. Only those strategies that generate above average payoffs have the chance to spread. Therefore, from an evolutionary perspective, there will be no cooperators in the end, which contradicts the observed cooperation in reality. So we expect defection to dominate, and we expect no cooperation, even though in reality we observe cooperation. A variety of mechanisms have been proposed to explain the considerable level of cooperation observed under certain circumstances. These include kin selection, direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, group selection, and network reciprocity. In particular, it is interesting that the spatial population structure can significantly change the level of cooperation in a population. While there could be a coevolution of social structure and cooperation due to migratory behavior, this subject has not been well studied in the past. So that's what they're going to do here. So they go through some real-world data from different urban areas. They're looking at the city of Chicago and the movement of immigrants in the early 20th century. And they see that in that data set, they have different types of succession processes of specific cultural groups, where you have sort of an initial settlement, you have conflict, you have recession and reorganization. So you have groups that move into a certain area, other groups will kind of move into the same area, there will be conflict, and then there will be resegregation of those areas by that group. So the invasion is sort of when new groups move into an area and then the dynamics change. So the invasion then can be initiated by a few pioneers who manage to enter a new area dominated by older residents. For example, people will move to an area and then, have social connections, and that, other people will move into the area, and then there will be this succession. So that's the idea. And then, of course, this assumes that everyone in a certain group, that they have this affinity with everyone in that group. So that's kind of the assumption being made here. So, following the initial invaders, invasions can happen on a much larger scale, in particular if housing prices go down. So it's like dependent on housing prices, at least in this data set. Then previous residents who want to sell their houses at a good price are eventually replaced. People may even move without reasons, just following a trend of what others do, which is a kind of collective herding behavior. So this is an important point, is that sometimes these decisions are made sort of consciously, and sometimes it's just kind of following some trend that you're observing. Because sometimes you know what the payoff is, and sometimes you don't, but you have this sort of signal that's, maybe people are cooperating, maybe people are defecting, and you're trying to get the best payoff. Accompanying this replacement process, the changing composition of the population may cause conflicts due to incompatible cultural values and prejudices. So it's, again, is it conscious or unconscious in terms of how the strategy is followed. So this results in a turnover, and you can see these spatial dynamics play out. So this is, again, something we can model computationally. Spatial games based on lattices would allow for one to study such effects. In conventional spatial games, individuals are uniformly distributed in the simulation area and change or repeat their strategies following a certain updating rule. So an individual is assumed to unconditionally adopt the most successful strategy within that neighborhood. On the one hand, this creates typical spatiotemporal patterns. On the other hand, spatial structures play an important role in the maintenance of cooperation. So this is where, you kind of have certain assumptions of the payoff matrix, and that determines what the spatiotemporal pattern looks like. But also, if you have a certain spatiotemporal pattern that exists, it sort of sets the terms of the payoff structure. So it may be more likely that you cooperate or less likely that you cooperate, depending on what the existing spatial structure is. So if you already have a segregated neighborhood, then it's like probably the cooperative imperative there may be higher. And so that's kind of the idea here. In the iterative prisoner's dilemma, for example, clusters of cooperators are beneficial to cooperators, while the evolving spatial structure in the snowdrift game, which is a variant of prisoner's dilemma, and that's a game where the way this game works is that you have two snowplows, and they are plowing a road from different ends. This is like in a mountainous area. And the snowplows come to a certain point where they meet. And the idea is, do they cooperate to move the rest of the snow out of the way? Or do they not cooperate? And so this is kind of, you can model, sometimes these games are based on things like idiosyncrasies in the world. And people observe this thing and they kind of name a game after it. So, that's what the snowdrift game is. It's just a variation on the prisoner's dilemma. But it has very similar dynamics. And so, we can look at that game and, it's a little bit different than the prisoner's dilemma because there's an explicit spatial structure in it. And so the snowdrift game can inhibit cooperation. So when you get a different type of game or structure of a game, it can have different dynamics. Conventional spatial games, however, neglect the possibility of individuals to move or migrate, although mobility is a well-known fact of daily social interactions. We will see that the movement of individuals, or what we might call population succession, can change the spatial structure of a population significantly and influence the evolution of cooperation dramatically. So this is where we get into spatial games with mobility. So these are what we call mobility games. And so we have different ways to classify these. We have 8 ways to classify them. Number 1 is that mobility may take place in a physical or geographic space with multiple dimensions, or it can occur in an abstract space like something like opinion space if we're looking at sort of different types of epistemic models. Rather than a grid, we might have a network structure like a friendship network, and we can play the game there. Number 2 is that one may distinguish between games with continuous and discrete motion. So, whether the movement is sort of a trajectory or whether it's across a grid and has different number of steps. The first ones may be considered as particular cases of differential games. So continuous games are sort of differential games where you can derive differentiable functions and do things like calculus on them. And those can be called motion games. The second ones will be named migration games and can be implemented, for example, in terms of cellular automata. So this is where we have the grid, where we have movement across that grid that's more categorical in nature. Number 3, the mobility game may be deterministic, i.e. noisy, influenced by fluctuations, or having this sort of stochastic property. So it can be either deterministic or stochastic. Such noise can be introduced by stochastic update rules, and there are different ways you can kind of think about setting up that aspect of the game. Number 4, multiple occupation of a certain location may be possible, allowing for the agglomeration of individuals, or it may be prohibited. In the latter case, spatial exclusion requires spatial capacity constraints and or the respect or protection of some private territory. So this is, again, the dynamics we saw earlier where we were talking about different types of invasions of space and, kind of people's response to that behaviors. Whether they all kind of move in mass or they kind of move as sort of a signal that they see in the environment, or they don't move at all. Number 5, in mobility games of spatial exclusion, empty sites are needed. Therefore, the density of free locations is a relevant model parameter. So if you have a very dense grid where no one can move, of course, then you can't really have a mobility game. If you have a very sparse grid, then people can move, or agents can move. And if you have a moderate grid, sometimes you have spatial constraints. So it's like they might have, it might be that there's an imperative to move, or, there might be a place where you can get a higher payoff, but you can't move because that area is jammed. So you take the next best payoff. Number 6, the frequency, rate, or speed of mobility may be relevant as well and should be compared with other timescales, such as the frequency of strategy changes or the average lifetime of a spatial cluster of individuals. Depending on the specification of the game, after a transient time, one may find everything from chaotic patterns up to frozen patterns, which can be expressed by a viscosity parameter. So in spatial arrays, we usually have this thing called a jamming phase transition, where you have the movement of things through a space. And then sometimes they're dense enough so that at a critical parameter value, they jam. And that means that they go from this sort of, motion to this frozen state. And it's totally dependent on density. So if the density decreases, movement starts again. But there's usually this change in state based on this critical parameter value of the ability to move. Mobility, number 7, mobility may be random or directed. So it may be success-driven or it might be random. And so if it's random, then the agent isn't looking for the best payoff, they're just moving around. If it's directed, then they're looking for a better payoff, and that's success-driven. Although they may not be finding success immediately, they're moving towards a higher level of payoff. Directed mobility may depend on the expected payoff in a certain time point, iteration, or it may depend on the cumulative payoff, which is the accumulation of payoffs over time, over iterations. And then number 8, if age, birth, and death are considered, one speaks of demographic games. So you can actually play these games with agents that are maximizing their payoff over time, or you can have replicators where agents die and new agents are born, which are descendants of the old agents, and they kind of accumulate this payoff, and the new agents can have different sets of epistemic conditions or values, and they can change their behavior accordingly. And sometimes the payoffs change as well. So that would be a demographic game. So they're focusing on games with success-driven migration in two-dimensional geographic space. Furthermore, we will assume simple strategies such as all cooperate or all defect, no memory, no forecasting abilities. So this is an example of a discrete game where you have this focal individual that's an empty circle. You have red individuals and black individuals, or these red and black pawns or agents. And you have an equal number of each. So you have 8 neighbors of this focal individual in 2 different states. We assume that all individuals prefer places that can provide a higher payoff. However, movements are restricted by mobility and the factors implicated in mobility, and the number of free locations, is one can only move to empty places, and in a residential context it would be if they can afford to move to that place. So there may be places that have different accessibility values. In a residential setting it would be how much does a place cost. In this case it's just kind of like how accessible is that spot on the board. In our model, the mobility is reflected by the migration range M, which can be assumed constant, or as a function of cumulative payoffs. So you can move farther if you have more of a payoff that you can either attain or have had in the past. So movement may be specified proportionally to the distance moved, and beta is a constant in this equation here. When the migration range M is restricted by the cumulative payoff, one may set the migration function here. So this is the example here where you have a focal individual and they could have neighborhoods of different sizes. You have a Moore neighborhood of range 1. A Moore neighborhood is every neighbor that's either adjacent, every neighbor that's adjacent in one movement to the focal cell, it's either diagonal or cardinal direction. In a Moore neighborhood of range 2, you have 2 cells. So the neighborhood is 2 cells deep in all such neighbors. Okay, so that's kind of an example of what we're doing in a discrete game with a Moore neighborhood, and it's very similar to what we see in a cellular automata. And so the expected payoff for individual I, applying strategy small I at a free location x prime within the migration range, can be calculated with this function, where you account for the strategies of the individuals located within a neighborhood centered at location x prime. Here we assume that the individual can determine this value by testing in neighborhood n prime by means of some kind of fictitious play with its residents. So in other words, you can figure out what the payoff is and what the value of doing something is by communicating with people or agents, or you can get a kind of a gist of what the other agents are doing by observation. So that's the idea. You're just getting information from the surrounding environment. All individuals are assumed to maximize the expected payoff by migrating to the place that promises the highest payoff. Consequently, the payoff at the new destination for I is expected to be this function here, where we maximize for the payoff, where A represents the area within the migration range M around xi. In our model, individuals decide to move if the expected payoff at the new position satisfies the short-term cost-benefit condition here, where your payoff is greater than not moving. If we assume that the cost of each movement is small and the new neighborhood yields a comparatively high cumulative payoff over the time period the individual stays at that place, then the cost of movement can be neglected. But usually there is a cost of movement that is something to account for. Finally, if two or more places promise the same maximum payoff, we assume that the individual will choose the closest one. If both the payoff and distance are the same, then the individual will randomly choose one of the closest locations in our simulation. Since all the other individuals also seek new places that can increase their payoffs, neighborhoods may change quickly, and the resulting payoff may fall below the expectations before the move during this fictitious play step. So sometimes you have this sort of you have this turnover, and sometimes you don't. And then the question is, why is that? And so sometimes it has to do with the payoff structure, sometimes it has to do with where other people can go, and there is this aspect of kind of figuring out what everyone else is doing, what payoff everyone else is getting. And then in human dynamics, like in the case of residential neighborhoods, you have this aspect of identity as well. And then we talk about learning. So learning allows individuals to adapt their behaviors in response to other people's behaviors in an interactive decision-making setting. Basic learning mechanisms are, for example, unconditional imitation, best reply, and reinforcement learning. So we want to include a learning step here. So we have this observation step or fictitious play, then we want to learn from that. So we can use different types of kernels, I guess, for learning. We might just have imitation, where you just copy other people, and that results in a very rudimentary type of set of dynamics. You have best reply, which is, okay, out of these options, what's my best option? And then reinforcement learning, where you select the best policy. And there are other types of ways to do this as well. Now, for our open source sustainability project, we kind of have this sort of spatial structure in our agent-based models. And there's no explicit spatial structure in open source communities, except that you do have these sort of dynamics where you have to kind of figure out what other people are doing and coordinate with that. So we use reinforcement learning. We also use active inference, and there are other ways you can do this as well, with personality models or with other types of models. So this is kind of one of these things for multi-agent systems. You have to kind of figure out the best way to model it and what gives you the best set of conditions. So they go through unconditional imitation, which is where you just copy the behaviors of others. It results in a lot of hurt. It overemphasizes herding as a high payoff strategy. Reinforcement learning is kind of a backwards-looking learning behavior, i.e. people tend to take the actions that yielded the highest payoffs in the past. So if something has yielded a high payoff in the past, you replicate that in the present. This is one of the things about reinforcement learning that is maybe a problem for a problem like this. And that is, it doesn't allow for new or novel solutions to occur. So if you kind of make the same mistakes in the past, you replicate those mistakes, you keep making them. It's worth thinking that reinforcement learning was originally kind of a behaviorist model for behavior, and they did a lot of the experiments in rodents. And so it was always about, like, can you remember where the food is, basically? And so that's where reinforcement learning really kind of got refined. And then, of course, it was applied to artificial intelligence, where it's very good at sort of building sort of memories or building learned locations or learned things. But it's not necessarily very good at incorporating new information. So this is kind of a point that we need to think about. And then, of course, there are other types of learning models we can use. They talk about this best reply, which is where you choose your strategy based on the expectation of what others will do in a way that maximizes their payoff. So you're trying to it's almost like a theory of mind type of thing where you're trying to figure out what other people are doing and how their payoff is working and then how your payoff should work. So you're forecasting other people's forecasts, and then you have to have a belief about how other people behave. So you have to have sort of a theory of mind here. And so that's what best reply is. We can think of other models as well for dealing with, this problem of an agent trying to figure out what other agents are going to do. So in this model, players can only interact with the 4 nearest neighbors and adapt their strategies by unconditional imitation. And so this is where they run the simulation. And here's some results. So in figure 3, they have these 49 by 49 grids. They show the results for migration only, imitation only, and migration and imitation. So this is where, I guess migration is where they're actively seeking a higher payoff. Imitation is where they're just imitating their neighbors. And then you have both. And when you have both, it looks like you're getting sort of the best result. Let's see. So, let's see. They don't really mention it in the legend. Let's go down to the bottom here. So yeah, I guess the idea here is that the mix of those two things, imitation and migration, are the best. Here we've examined how individual preferences can change the spatial population structure in a very simple social system, considering migratory behavior. The revealed social process can, to some extent, reflect the dynamics of population succession in urban areas. This corresponds to case B in figure 3. Consider the payoff matrix for that figure and imagine that an individual of group 1 happens to be located in the neighborhood of group 2. So when they're talking about B, they're talking about this strip of results. So migration and imitation is here. It seems to give the best result. B actually models residential segregation in the data set that we talked about. So that's kind of what they're referring to here. So if we consider the payoff matrix that generated that figure 3B, and imagine that an individual of group 1 happens to be located in that neighborhood of group 2. For the previous residents, this may not change a lot. However, it attracts other members of group 1 who are not yet living in a neighborhood of group 1 individuals. This can trigger collective migration of other group 1 members. Since interactions between members of group 1 and 2 bring positive payoffs only for members of group 1, group 2 will finally leave for new places. Of course, this process repeats, just like the circle of population succession that we talked about earlier. One may notice that here we do not differentiate the intention to migrate and the actual migratory behavior. So there's no intentionality that's separated from the payoff. In daily life, however, the movement of people is restricted by many more factors, such as wealth and time, so people do not migrate often, even if they are motivated to move. So sometimes you can't move because you don't have the space on the grid. Sometimes there are other things you could model, other factors in the mind of the agent that you could model. They don't do so here. In our simulations as well, migration activity after a few iterations is small. So starting with a high migration rate due to the artificial choice of a random initial distribution, the migration rate quickly drops to a low level. Of course, other factors determining migration can be easily added to the above proposed framework of migration games. And so then they link this back to the prisoner's dilemma and the promotion of cooperation. So this is where in figure 4 they show the migration only case with the imitation only case corresponding to m equals 0 and the combined imitation and migration case with m equals 5. In the imitation only case, the proportion of cooperators is greatly reduced. So figure 5 is down here, and it's a similar thing to what we saw for figure 3. This is migration only, where m equals 5, imitation only, where m equals 0. This is migration. And then migration and imitation, m equals 5. So you see that that's what they're referring to there. So in the imitation only case, the proportion of cooperators is greatly reduced because you don't know what you're cooperating with. You're just imitating other people. You don't really know what the payoff is. However, the combination of migration and imitation strikingly promotes the level of cooperation. Our explanation is that when individuals have mobility, cooperative clusters are more likely to be promoted in the presence of invasion attempts of defectors. We can see that in the migration-only case, cooperators manage to aggregate and to form clusters. Although defectors attempt to enter cooperative clusters, they finally end up at the boundaries of cooperative clusters as cooperators split to evade defectors and re-aggregate in new places where defectors are excluded. And so in the prisoner's dilemma, it is guaranteed that 2R is greater than T plus S, which means that the attractive force between cooperators is mutual and strong, while the interaction between a cooperator and a defector leads to a unilateral attractive force where T is greater than 0. When when 0 is greater than S, a cooperator replies to defectors even in a repulsive way. Therefore, defectors are less successful in joining or entering cooperative clusters than cooperators are. So there's almost this attraction-repulsion dynamic with respect to these different strategies. So when a strategy is stronger, you have this attractive force. When the other factor is stronger or weaker, a cooperative force is preferred. And so they kind of get into how these dynamics work. And let me get to let's get to the conclusions. We have introduced the concept of migration games by considering success-driven motion. Migration games can easily reproduce macroscopic stylized facts of various social phenomena based on individual actions and interactions. Typical examples are population succession and residential segregation. These aggregate outcomes emerge from interactions between individuals in a non-trivial way, and a theoretical analysis allows us to qualitatively understand the relation between microscopic interactions and the emergent macroscopic phenomena. For the prisoner's dilemma, we have shown that self-organized cooperative structures can promote the level of cooperation. Moreover, we have verified that an enhancement of cooperation by success-driven motion is robust to different kinds of noise. We even find that moderate noise levels can promote the cooperation level further. The underlying mechanism is that in the migration game, success-driven motion will monotonously increase, which means linearly, the total payoff in the noiseless system, which however can lead the system into a locally optimal state. The effect of noise can drive the system out of local optima towards the globally optimal state. And then they talk a little bit about the links to sociology and some of the other things that we originally talked about. It would be natural to extend migration games in order to study the coevolutionary dynamics of population structure and urban growth. In the long run, we hope this will contribute to a better understanding of planning and population dynamics in a city. I was kind of hoping that would be relevant to multi-agent systems and how we model things. And sometimes we have this explicit spatial component, and sometimes we have this model where we want to have the sort of quasi-spatial component that allows us to model certain behaviors. And then, of course, we have this sort of model of, I don't know if it's intelligence or decision making, where we might use reinforcement learning or we might replace that with other methods, and to see which one works best there. Okay, so that's all I have for that. Do we have any questions?
It's it reminds me a lot of models that my mother is very familiar with from from this kind of sociological housing. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
I feel very uncultured to do this, but I miss so much of things, and the paper specifically that you just went through, and I heard that it was like, oh, it's related to multi-agent, blah blah
That
blah.
kind of work.
Could you give like a brief 1 or 2 sentence summary so I can enjoy it for myself?
Oh, yeah.
It's very
So,
selfish, but yeah.
well, it's okay. So what they're doing is they're looking at these moving agents. So they're looking at agents that move around a space, and they were making the analogy with sociological models of migration and segregation patterns. So there's this famous problem showing segregation model, which shows that if you have agents of different types, they tend to, have different dynamics where they'll segregate into different areas of the board. And it's supposed to be a sort of a metaphor for when we see residential segregation. How does that happen? And what they're doing here is they're actually using the prisoner's dilemma to model how agents make decisions and how they maximize their payoff. So the idea is that you have your agents, they're moving around this space, and they're moving to places that maximize their cooperation and minimize their defection. So if you're familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, you can either cooperate or defect and turn in your co-conspirator. And we talked about that, and I covered that. In any case, the idea is you can play these games out in space, and you can observe different dynamics. And then this is linked to sort of this multi-agent problem by saying if we give the agents some set of behaviors, what will they do? Will they maximize their payoff intentionally? Will they follow other people? Will they, how does this affect kind of how they behave and how they coordinate their behavior?
Okay,
And then
cool. Thank you.
the spatial component actually just adds this aspect of, you could observe those payoff matrices in mathematics, but this just shows how how people sort of make decisions, and it gives them an impetus for displaying that behavior graphically, I guess.
I assume this was done somewhat in mind with all the multi-agent stuff that I've mentioned before, and the sort of I really feel like the way that things are going, and I don't know. I can segue this into some other things to talk about as I proceed, but excuse me. The things that are brewing right now and things that are brewing in data and direction, and also a really fantastic Diginess meeting last night. There's just a lot there. There's a lot there, and maybe some of the folks, it may be good to show them the paper that you just reviewed. We'll see.
Okay. So yeah, why don't we get into an update?
Okay. Let me. I'll be able to say more in like 20 seconds proper, but
well, sorry if I could just finish up there.
Please.
Like these are things that are in NetLogo, right?
Yeah, I
Bradley?
think they were. I don't remember what
mean,
method they were using.
It seems like it would be.
Yeah, because it's like I'm just thinking about Epstein's books. Like he's got like 3 books on he's got 3 books on NetLogo, and this is like I think they caught. Anyway, it's like you can also model insurgencies with this kind of same kind of migration, and group ID model.
Yeah.
I think that's like some of the examples that he covers. And
Yeah. I remember, like, we did this conference, this workshop a couple years ago where they had his work kind of prominently discussed.
yeah,
It was a agent
yeah.
based conference or
Okay.
workshop, and yeah, it's like this is the stuff where, but I think the impetus for agent based models was to look at like different types of problems like that, but in the space, have a spatial
Right.
component to it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was super abstract, but like um it would be like telling, it was kind of getting at this point of like how quickly does a community turn,
Right.
um and like what were kind of like environmental or other factors that like encouraged that conversion or discouraged it, um that they could throw in, even though it wasn't spatially necessarily accurate.
Yeah. Well, I
um
think the
but you
other
could model
thing
the
is,
thinking.
yeah, the other thing is you're modeling emergence, right? So you're
Yes,
modeling
yeah,
like what
exactly,
happens when a bunch of people do
exactly,
something. What are tipping
exactly,
points? Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I was. It just made me think about how, or like wondering how, because those were like, you know, kind of like 1970s
Yeah.
understandings. I mean,
Yeah.
if I remember right, like I think the books were 90s, but like it was like very old data and ideas.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, I wonder how that's changed, at least with insurgency models, because like I wanted to say that they felt like they were actually much better at predicting. Um, I'll try and find this guy, but he was absolutely doing mathematical modeling of insurgency patterns, and was
Yeah.
getting invited to lots of conferences in like 20, like the 2000 plus, like
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah, it is an old area. Like in sociology, it's from like the 60s and 70s. And then people use those references as kind of like the inspiration for the more modern work. There are a lot of ways you can build these models that are like more sophisticated. I mean, this is kind of an attempt to link this to game theory because it's not typical. I mean, the lattice models don't automatically assume game theoretic structure. It's just kind of like we run these agents and they have different rules that they use to make decisions, and you can model things that way. But in with linking game theory to this, you get this payoff structure that gives you an added dimension of doing things. And then, of course, the spatial aspect is pretty abstract. I mean, the agents are pretty abstract. The spatial aspect is also abstract because it's like assuming that they're sort of that you have a finite number of places to move, or you have these imperatives to move to different locations, and it's not like you might find in the real world, I guess.
yeah, I'm gonna find this. That I feel like he was bringing like time series, or
Yeah.
some distribute, some distribution in terms of frequency. um and yeah, anyway, I'll find it. Sorry, I
Yeah.
dropped off there for a second, like I'm just getting to the lab.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No problem. And so you can have the sophisticated dynamics that are like real world dynamics. I mean, you can just model kind of stochastic behavior or some sort of pattern behavior, or like with a lot of real world dynamics, there usually some sort of Poisson process or something even more complex than that.
Yeah, it's, I just yeah, but like a Poisson process is so old. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
Like I yeah, Like that would just be such an obvious one. Like, what was the Poisson process actually developed for? Forget.
It was like
Um, and,
think about
and it
arrivals.
wasn't. Okay, I'm almost to the lab. I go. I'll look this up. This is gonna.
Okay, yeah. We'll have a trivia check later. We'll just ask.
I also feel like it's just this like my guess here that it's also misattributed to Poisson, but
Oh, okay.
that's my bonus trivia point.
Looks like Jesse might be ready to give an update. I was wondering if you wanted to go over some of the stuff that we talked about in Cognition Futures.
Uh, yeah. And there's let me get to that because my mind that's like the bottom of the list right now.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in talking about that, and I do want to I want to ask you about that because I want to center some points because I know you and as it we, if you will, have more to say about that paper. So it was a very interesting paper, but I'll kind of work up to that. To go through my week, we had DevoWorm, we had a number the cohort meetings are going very well, and they're kind of forming some clusters as well. Like what people are working on in data and direction, for example, are kind of establishing into three major clusters. One of them sort of the policy cluster, where we're just looking at what has happened in the big tech, basically major AI labs and policy from the DoD stuff to some of the internal policy disputes. Different people are looking at different aspects of that. There is the agent characteristics, which kind of fits with a little bit of what we talked about today, but just looking at some specific parts. One of the interns, Violet, is looking at moral AI, which is different than, it's a very specific topic around moral operation, performance, and evaluation, internal structure of the agent that way. Kind of very cognitive science type lens. I think Violet has a background in cognitive science, so that's why. And one of the major impetuses that I'll kind of just allude to and not get into for the multi-agent, I want to get multi-agent meeting, is Alicia's work on, originally inspired by sort of community of agents or community of user human encounters as a unique or as a particular lens on either regulation or maintaining particular let's say bounds. So that's creating sort of like this in intra agents and inter agent characteristics and community structures that lead to some of the what are the regulatory implications of specific things in those domains. So you have like policy cluster, the agent characteristic or community characteristic cluster, and then also today I actually just met with the sort of middle ground, which is a little bit in between. We have a cluster that is basically examining frameworks, particularly at the design level, but the RAF paper, the reflection agency paper, is sort of the anchor to that again, and the individual was inspired by that. So we're basically looking at that and looking at other things, and they have ongoing experience in another role that they're in, where they're using at enterprise level certain clusters of tools, and so it kind of is an interesting hybrid opportunity of they're using it professionally in industry in certain cases and having to like teach and show other people how to use some of them while doing sort of this research side with us that is looking at frameworks for advising how to do designing for good uses or ethical uses or flourishing type things. So that's sort of an interesting cluster in the data and direction space that's emerging. We've had our second or third cohort meeting. We're a little bit behind where Google Summer Code is, but we're kind of the same general pathway of we're kind of into it now, and we're just sort of turning around the initial bend and these things have kind of gotten legs now and they're moving and growing and not being static anymore. So that's a very interesting thing, and I'm very proud of that cohort for doing that, staying with us and getting to that place. So that's data and direction. And what's been interesting is the overlap between some things there and some things here. And by that I mean like the lab proper. By that I mean some of the multi-agent stuff. Violet, who's sort of the cognitive science background, is not really. It's on a very short vacation for graduation fun and stuff like that. Otherwise, I would totally insert them into the Cognition Futures meetings proper, which we can talk to soon. Violet's super interested in. I did a little preview of Cognition Futures and what we've been looking at, some Varela stuff from embodiment stuff, some of the previous things we talked about, and it was very in line with her interests. So that may be something ahead as well. What else do I have to say? I'm trying to go through the week and think about stuff. Wednesdays are very busy days for me, but I'm very happy to have, if we can all meet Wednesday and do Cognition Future stuff, then that's excellent. We kind of ran out of time for some things to get to the paper today, but we can talk about that a little bit soon. And the only other thing I'll say is DigiNest was very nice yesterday. We had some more, I don't know how to really call them. Basically, DigiNest, as the public-facing version of DigiNest as a discussion series, is Avery, myself, and Molly as these sort of co-hosts. And we talked about papers and related things. It's a little bit less structured than a seminar series, but not as structured as I don't want to call it a podcast. That feels a little bit off to me. Maybe that's just personal preference, but it's a discussion series. It's a public-facing discussion series. We had some new people join us over the last week or two as non-hosts, as sort of, I don't want to say audience members, but something more like in-house people stopping by, which has been very good. What we did a lot of I think we had the most sort of coherent. What is DigiNest? We spent a little bit of time introducing DigiNest relative to what else is going on in the JoPro, the broader community, at Orthogonal Lab, and all this other stuff. But we had a very nice time of going through what it is and what we've been doing over the last 6 or 7 months. So, and that was that should be recorded and recorded pretty well. So I'll be able to show many people who haven't been able to attend, hey, what are we doing? What have we looked at? Just some papers, but also project ideas. How does this fit with everything else? And I think it was a nice mutual exchange between Avery and myself. We wish Molly was there, but we might see Molly in a few weeks when she comes to a Boston event in July. But it was a very good I don't know, a major sense of, okay, a lot of things are taking shape more fully this week. So positive stuff to that end. I feel like there's one or two things I'm missing as well, and I can't quite remember what they are, so maybe they'll pop up. But otherwise, we can jump into Cognition Futures and the paper for the reading group this week. I don't know if do you have things you want to just say, or I know there was stuff you kind of wanted to say, but we ran out of time. We basically just loosely covered the not fun parts of the paper where they're setting up their argument, and the next week we're going to kind of go into what they're saying more so. But anything you want to start with?
Well, I thought it was an interesting paper from the standpoint of they approached goals as sort of this, I guess you could call it culture-bound thing. The idea was that goals has been approached kind of from a Western perspective when we talk about goals in cognitive science or goals in agent systems or multi-agent systems, that sort of thing. And so if I have a goal, or a robot has a goal to do something, it's usually a motivation, and it has a certain type of sort of cultural cachet in terms of how it's structured in the mind of the agent. And so they were talking about what are these telic states from Buddhism, and how that it's different from like what we think about in the West as a goal. And so that
Yeah.
was interesting. And I was thinking in terms of like reinforcement learning, again, as I mentioned in the last paper, reinforcement learning is kind of built from this idea of like a certain experimental setting, right? And then it's been interpreted in a certain way. So what happens if, actually we extend our lens to like, goals as being different types of things? And I think this paper kind of gets at it, but there's a lot more I think that we're going to cover.
Yeah, like I feel I really like the paper in part because let's just uh, throw myself under the bus. I'm so obsessed with teleology, purpose, and behavior, like as concepts in the 1943 paper, and just say, oh, like I'm just so fixated on that. But what I really mean, more than that, is I think it's a nice. I'm curious to read what the other folks have been doing. Avery was kind of fixated on, oh, where do the goals come from, and that's sort of like that's because that's Avery's like thing, like Avery's allostatic kinds, different regulations, non-uniformity of interpersonal, lopsidedness, etc. And that kind of took over part of the conversation, and thank you for being generous with that. But there's like like there's a lot of things that I think are. I look forward to next week's going through some of them more. And I kind of wish Amanda was there. I might try to like really seed the document so that she can have some say on some things. But like, yeah, even the broader sense of this sort of bringing awareness to, let's say, conventional reinforcement learning, and it's sort of I don't know if the right word is epistemic here or ontological more so. I always get ontology always as a phrase. I know what it is, but like when I use it, it bothers me for some reason, and so I never feel like I'm using the word ontology right. But what I mean here is when the paper pointed out designing, conceptually seeing as like reinforcement learning as you must have a descriptive layout first, and then an evaluation on top of it as a like this is a structure to how to solve. You create a domain, you have a reward in a particular way, and you do it in this particular sequence, and in a hierarchical sequence, if you will. And it's sort of gesturing, and I don't know if they did a perfect job of this, but this sort of gesturing of, okay, like how can we, what can we do by having it be not as hierarchical, not as first this then that, but maybe more co-developed in this idea of telic states, or I think there were some questions either by Avery or Amanda or you or all of us about, well, by telic states you basically just mean affordances, or like what's the difference between an afforded state or a state where you see an affordance and a goal, or a state where you see affordances and like, is that basically a telic state? Like, oh, you've perceived an affordance, an opportunity in the environment, so therefore you've entered a telic state. Maybe, and feel free to correct or comment on this, but I think what I would say is like, I just saying this now and walking around in my own city here, I'm reminded of Johann John, and sort of RIP, not to him. I think he's doing well. I think he's like married and has a kid, and he's living that great life. But like RIP to Johann John's excellent, like inspirational Johann John's version of the Cognition Futures group, and his great lectures and the very accessible things he made about exploring some stuff. Because in one of them, I will always remember this sort of phrase, kind of like my Norbert Wiener quote. This is one I associate with Johann John. I don't know if he was quoting someone or said it himself, but basically, uh, it's not that we see differences; it's we see with differences, which is sort of along the lines of um, the Norbert Wiener alternatives quote. And in this context of here, like telic states, as in the different lenses that let, like the goal, the objective or the goal as, I think, to very charitably get at what the paper is trying to do, the goal as a means of non-hierarchically situating the environment and the reward or the goal or the end state in a way that is a little more mutually informed than, kind of doing this broader questioning work of like what can classic reinforcement learning do in the way that it's structured, the way that it's made explicit, in the way that some of it's more, I don't want to say information complete is maybe too strong, but the way that things are a little bit more structured, obviously, in relation to each other. And what are things that are alternates to that are more, where that doesn't hold as well. And that's what a telic state might specifically comment on. So that's a lot of things. And I'm curious if you have any follow-ups to all that.
Yeah, I think the idea that, well, it goes back to what I was saying before, that we basically construct goals, right? Like it isn't that a goal just is something in the world that's like beyond us. It's like we construct it. Even like if you're a rodent and you're trying to find food, and you try a bunch of options and you finally lock onto a strategy that's always gets you food. That's a policy that you select. But the
Yeah,
goal, of course, is getting food. And I mean, the goal would be survival, I guess. But it's that specific goal of getting a piece of cheese, say, is something you kind of figure out. You say, oh, that's something that's positive. I'm going to keep doing that. And you'll see this with like in studies of addiction, where people talk about like the sort of reinforcement learning that happens there, where you either like kind of keep going back to the drug or you stop doing it in there. Different rewards for that are the reward structures that are involved in that. So the goal is like driven by maybe something like dopamine signaling, but the
mm-hmm.
actual thing that you're doing in the world is constructed from what's in the world. It's a similar thing. And so that I think that was an insight from the paper, and I think that gets back to what Avery was talking about. What is a goal? A goal is something that you do in the world. It might result from different types of drives that you have internally, but externally, it's going to always be based on the situation. So
Right.
yeah.
It's a bit of like top down, bottom up. Like externally speaking, the goal, and this is why, like, I'm imagining I'm superimposing the allostatic Hines diagram here. Not because I think it's the one true diagram, but just what I think Avery was trying to get at. Even thinking about like that diagram was like 3 years old or so, and even in that sense, 3 years from ago, and from more modern discussions, there's a top-down element of, provided a for lack of better terms, a desire, an internal recognition that some change, something needs to be moved in let's say a basal affectivity type sense, or like slightly above it. So, and maybe in the emotional sense, as Fuchs would say, of direction setting, something has to be the internal like maybe not signal, but recognition, if you will. Something internally has to move closer to, more of, or less away from. Like more or less, like move, some kind of a generic, even scalar, like uh, just more or less of the thing. Like there's something internally that is seems to be a requirement in terms of the agent's volitional allocation, right? But from the top down perspective, it's like the environment offers a finite buffet, a finite arrangement of things. So it's sort of like what end are you looking at? It's like given a goal, the environment offerings will you have like a different lens or filter on it. But given, you know, it's a little bit of chicken or egg this way, I suppose, but also like I think to be sympathetic to some of Avery's points is that like the source of the goal in terms of a gentle, I like what I said about vocational allotment or allocation of volitional things in terms of like enacting a particular desire or moving, recognizing the basic more or less of it, right? It's sort of like that. There maybe is some kind of a primacy to that, but it depends. Like, are you looking at, is the lens that we're trying to look at sort of the top-down external, here's an environment, what can an agent do in it, or the other, I don't want to say, I really don't like the word generative, to use that word flippantly and very sort of trendy like right now. Like what is the, what is the mesh between that? So I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of stalling around a point that I want to make, but I'm not making it very well. Point being, I look forward to getting more deeper into the what the real meat of the paper, because we spend most of the time setting up their framing of reinforcement learning. So to be continued, perhaps.
Oh yeah, no problem. Yeah, I think I get what you're saying, and it's we should follow up on that. Good stuff. Yeah, it's. Go ahead.
I think to kind of pull it, and extrapolate's not the right word, to pull this into some other, it's like the feeling of like a kid, like a child that has food on their plate they don't want to eat, and so they spread it out. That's really what I mean. Like they spread, like, oh yeah, I've eaten my food, and they try to just diffuse it, even though it's not really going anywhere. To do a version of that, there's even in terms of the even in terms of what I was saying a few weeks, maybe months ago now, about the common currency of navigation and navigating epistemic spaces and navigating some other stuff, and the common currencies, dizzy, diverse intelligence, a sense. I think why the goal and telic states and autotelic agents, like that's one of the glossary terms, like autotelic agents are these things that can set their own goals, and like, oh, I think some core things about all of this that I don't think the paper answers, but what are leading things I'm very interested in are selection from alternatives. And I think the merit of the goal, like there's obviously some important things about goals, like goals and purposes, and I'm hitting the goal, and we mentioned like the Chan Buddhist stuff, and how it's like this generative thing as opposed to this rigid structure of like you have to implement this formula, and by implementing the formula you're going to get the desired result stuff. That's all has its place, but I think there's another lens of selection in and of itself, and selection from alternatives. So like the relationship between a goal and perception of an alternative, not just because of Norbert Wiener stuff, but like there's a fundamental, and then maybe because I don't know the literature well enough, but I see there's a fundamental, like there's something about the perception of alternatives themselves, goals or not. Like I think there's a difference between perceiving alternatives, and you can maybe say, well, that's affordances, but I don't know that it is in what I'm trying to say. Like the difference between alternatives of any kind, like perception, the nature of perceiving alternatives, full stop. Affordances, which are sort of environmentally tied, and then this sort of telic states or goal generation and goals as the lens by which you're basically I don't want to say generating, but the lens or the tagging that affordances or things to do from the agent into the environment are. I feel like thinking about those three things, and differentiating them and sorting out what I'm trying to get at with my alternative fixation is something I'm excited to do. And I appreciate the paper in and of itself, but I'm kind of hoping it will continue some of my other aims in that end. So I will step away from the edge of all that and maybe move on to other things.
Okay, yeah, it's a very good conversation. I think that's ties into the paper too. I was talking about some of the aspects of how agents are kind of determining a payoff for something, right? Like, what is my payoff for this thing? And then that determines how I move or what my goal is. So if I think there's a high payoff for something, I'm more likely to do it. The drive there is to get the highest payoff, but the strategy or the goal you use is different, and sometimes it's wrong, so you miss your target. But yeah,
And I think to be maybe overly charitable, if not somewhat charitable to Avery. And I've loved the term charitable and uncharitable because it lets me get away with a lot of things lately, and I'm enjoying that. To be overly charitable to Avery, there's an element of I think some of Avery's core work is like when you look at things like Prisoner's Dilemma, like decision and sort of decision theory and things like that. It's I'm sure there's some nuance here, and I think this is an unfair thing to say. So I'm being uncharitable to that realm of stuff and overly charitable to Avery, right? And I feel like some of those things are quite uniform. Like all prisoners are the same. All everybody is like, it just depends on sort of like their relative uh, you know, power dynamics or like the relative structure of the situation as a sort of logic, like the variation is the logical positioning of the agent relative to another agent. It is not about any internal particular qualities of the agent itself. And maybe I'm sure there's cases where that's not true in some of the things, but I feel for Avery in being intentionally overly charitable to Avery. I think Avery's delight and exacerbation about some of the stuff is like, well, clearly there's non-uniformity in the reward, the reward, the conception of the reward and the motivation to do it. Like, so I don't know. Let's move on. I feel like this could be a muddy pit that I don't want to get stuck in anymore.
that's fine. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that update and the conversation. That was great. Morgan, you had something you wanted to point out about the hilarity of the origins
Well,
of the
it's
Poisson
just
process.
yeah. So it does have its name from Poisson. Not that Poisson was the first, was not the discoverer, um, and Poisson was modeling, interestingly, uh, juries that are overruled,
Oh, okay.
or juries that falsely convict. Um, so was looking. It was like um, looking at judicial decisions in France was what the natural phenomena that he was following. Interestingly, though, the person who actually discovered this is someone. Uh, I'm not going to get this name right. Bordelitz, no, Borkolowitz. Anyway, and this particular sounds Polish, but maybe Prussian. Um, was analyzing the number of soldiers in the Prussian cavalry who were killed by accidental horse kick.
Yeah, That's
And he saw it as a real world tool for analyzing small, the law of small numbers,
okay. Yeah.
which I guess I'm happy. I'm happy that that's small numbers.
Yeah.
It's funny to think that like you potentially have an attrition rate that's like higher than your suicide rate from like just from horse kicks.
Yeah.
like like uh yeah, but then it also like what people might know this from is of course Geiger and like a Geiger counter,
Oh,
um
okay.
which makes a lot of sense anyway. uh but I did, the guy that I was thinking about was at Stanford, and of course what he's using, and this he's very much like a modern modern version of Epstein, who is it Epstein at Princeton, I forget.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. um uh is of course icing models, you know
Oh, okay.
like there's some interesting things about what, um anyway, I'll drop his. It looks like this is why I definitely saw him on like some podcast or some news show, because he's got a media page.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
you know, so like not all mathematicians have a media page, but reminds me of, or it seems like the chaotician in Jurassic Park,
Oh, yeah,
like
yeah. Ian
that kind
Malcolm.
of,
Yeah.
like
Yeah, Malcolm, yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, I just bring it up just because, like, it's another one of these domains where obviously people really care. There are some other there's some other differential equations that they use for war planning, like, or like war simulations. So it's like having multiple chemical processes, you know and uh happening, and how to deal with that, that really only comes out of like chemical engineering. I mean, in terms of like trying to handle that, it's like it's much more industrial,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is probably a good way to describe war these days.
Yeah.
Um, uh, but still relevant. Like there's still kind of like uh, a back and forth between that literature and them kind of more sociological. You know, um, uh,
Yeah, I think this is goes back to this discussion that we've had in different meetings on universality, right? Like
right.
you say there's this process in sociology, and you have this model that you can use. And then you can also use it for other things like modeling chemical species or modeling other, ecology or, and so the assumption is that they hold across these different application domains. So I can model
Yeah.
things in sociology, I can model things in chemistry and ecology, and I can get similar relevant results. But of course, you think about the agents, and you're like, well, the agents are vastly different in those systems. So it's like,
Yeah.
well, why is it
Yeah.
that we can get a result that's like, at least at the core screen level, very similar?
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
that's where
Yeah.
you're getting your whole body of complexity theory. um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And as a anyway, I took the, I don't know if I already had said this, but I took the Levin paper, the mathematical paper, and generated empirical simulations using using Ising models,
Oh wow.
or
Okay.
like using statistical mechanics models
Yeah.
to generate empirical demonstrations of their theorems and propositions.
All right. That's
And just as a you know, um, can agents do it? I also generated lean proofs. So generated a lean scaffold, and to prove all their theorems,
oh wow.
and to link a few things together that they hadn't done. I mean, by doing that, you could actually find what like what you would need to get to the next step if you wanted to make it, if you wanted to satisfy the theorem solver,
Yeah.
as well as like what was missing to make the leap to um, the conjecture that they had about large language models.
Yeah.
So there's just some interesting things. You can find that in the um, my quantum models, which starts talking about icing and moves to spin glass models and things like that.
Okay.
Uh, these are, but it's like this universality where it's these statistical mechanics can represent lots of different concepts. Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like the paper, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. It
This
should
is
be the
mathematics.
unreasonable effectiveness of stat mech.
Yeah, I mean, somebody must have, there's an archive paper that says that.
Yeah. If
Like,
there
that
isn't,
just
there
seems
should
like
be
such an
one.
obvious. Yeah, it seems like such an obvious. I'll I have my repos also produce an agent generated paper, off the basis of their, what kind of work that they've done. So yeah, I think that's what I should make the title. I actually did I tell you I had the so for the Weight Watchers stuff, um I have the title be, what would James do? So, you know
Who is James?
James,
James.
the physicist,
Okay.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
it kind of started maximum entropy.
Right. Right. Max and yeah, neg
Yeah,
entropy and all
et
that.
et James.
Yeah.
I think he's got the book on probability theory
Yeah. Yeah.
that a lot of Maxent people. Yeah. Anyway, I of course was just trying to get the WWJD,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it would be, what would a Bayesian do?
Right.
Is what it really is. Anyway.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Yes.
So stay away from the back end of a horse.
Absolutely.
That's the
Yeah.
lesson here.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks to everyone for contributing today and our great discussions. Kavya had something here. Yeah, so he had this, I guess, paper here. I came across a startup recently, and since we sometimes discuss things related to EEG or neuroimaging, I thought it would be good to share here. It tries to detect cancer and other diseases using olfactory sense of dogs and BCI on them. I was just curious whether there's actually a need for this, like our current method's expensive or less accurate.
Yeah. So
You want to
so
speak to that?
so that guy's a member of the tower.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Did the who posted that?
That was Kavya.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah. So yeah, Kavya, I know that guy.
Oh,
I forget if he's a member. I forget. I mean, I think he's biotech guy. And
I think this startup is based in Bangalore.
yeah. So he
Yeah.
goes back and forth. A lot of people come here to raise money. You know, but he goes back and forth. So he was actually a member before we moved to Frontier Tower. So he was biopunk before Frontier Tower. Yeah. But yeah, they're using it for cancer detection, and you know, I mean, there are these anecdotal stories, and uh, about odors, a person's odor changing with a variety of ailments. So I think Parkinson's is also one where there can be a change, and yeah, but I don't know much about like his he's definitely collecting data in India.
Yeah, actually, yeah. They were. I think he has published some papers as well, like showing some results. Yeah.
All right. Well,
I
thank
mean,
you. Go
this
ahead.
idea seemed pretty unique to me. Yeah. So I mean, I had not seen something
It,
like this happen before. So yeah.
well, there was another there was an organoid specific company called Konaku. Is it Konaku? Um, I want to say Konaku. Yes. Um, so this, I mean, they seem to have. I'll put this in. I'll put this in Dev Neuro AI just because this company has pivoted to building biocomputers, but their original focus was actually growing olfactory neurons, olfactory bulb, to do super sensitive detection, and they were trying to sell this to airlines to do bomb detection for. Sorry, I shouldn't. It was just one of these things where we were like, no, we get the point, but like, what makes you think that you can do that?
Yeah.
Whereas like a dog is very, dog it's got a great sniffer.
Right.
Um, but Kanaku was trying to do this in a dish and make a kind of biohybrid system, and yeah. Anyway, and now the they yeah, I don't know what happened because like their entire building went up for auction, like together with all the lab equipment, and the auction required that you bought the whole thing. Like you could only put one bid on, and it had to be like the whole building with everything in it, which was, it was crazy. But yeah, anyway, that's just funny stories of San Francisco tech.
Yeah. Excellent
Yeah,
strategy.
yeah. It's like it's funny because it's like it's easy to get -80 fridges. These big, these are really heavy. They consume a lot of power, and they can be quite expensive, but they're really easy to get as long as you come and pick it up.
Yeah.
like like because they've got to vacate the building, and they don't want to pay for a truck.
Yeah.
Anyway.
All right. Yeah. Thanks. That was a great discussion. Okay. So, yeah. Thanks to everyone, and see you next week. Bye.
See ya.